Hello, good morning. It is wonderful to be with you today. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to speak here at Paradox. I'm grateful for the invitation each time. It is a treat, and it's wonderful. And the chai is fabulous. It keeps me coming back. So thank you, David. Thank you. When Craig asked me to speak this weekend, I verified with him, because I know Paradox, we've been going through the Lectionary on many or most weeks. And so, and the last time I preached was back in the fall, if you recall, and it was on the Lectionary text, and he verified the yes. And so I was looking at the texts that were assigned for this week, and I noticed there were a bunch. I noticed Mark chapter 1 was one of those texts that was on the Lectionary, and then I noticed there was a bunch of others, and I dutifully chose Paul. Was like, no, I'm not going to be doing Mark. I'm going to do Paul, which is weird because usually I don't like to preach from Paul, but I chose Paul because I didn't want to preach on Mark chapter 1. And then a couple of weeks later, Craig called me back and said, hey, actually, we're going to be doing a series on the book of Mark, so could you just do the text that's there in the lectionary on the book of Mark? And I said, well, I guess I'm going to be preaching 2 times in a row at Paradox on a text that I probably would not have chosen otherwise. But I think, at least as I found, it was a text that I needed, and I hope that you find that for yourself as well. When I read Mark chapter 1, this story about the unclean spirit being cast out, I think of a story from my own life when I was 18 years old, and I went on a mission trip. Now, there's lots of things we could say about mission trips. I'm going to put those on the shelf for right now. Just stay with me. I went on a mission trip, and we went to southern Africa in Zambia, in the eastern part of the country. I had some people that were a part of our church community who had lived in this region for many, many years, and they ran a hospital there and a nursing school, and so they knew what folks were like and what some of the needs were. And so I went on this mission trip with my youth group. I was 18 years old, and we set up a medical clinic and a dental clinic. We ran those for a couple of weeks, totally free to everyone who came. But we also did interpersonal, one-on-one ministry, and that's what I found that I loved to do while we were on that trip. I went every day with one of my friends and one of the elders from the local churches, and we went and visited folks and talked with them and answered questions, and we studied the Bible, and we just had these one-on-one conversations, which is ironic because it's what I kind of do now for a living. I'm a therapist, and I sit and visit with people and answer questions and talk about what's going on in their life. And it was really in those days, every day going and visiting with folks, that I fell in love with what I understood to be ministry and started to think, maybe I should be a pastor. Well, on one of those days, I had an experience that was deeply impactful. It stuck with me anyway for many years since then. And as I told it to my group way back then, that night after it happened, I told the group, we participated in an exorcism today. It blew me away. And so I proceeded to tell them about this experience. We arrived at this woman's home. It was a concrete brick house, one little one-room house, maybe 200 square feet, like the size of a bedroom. And the roof was made out of grass, thatch. And I remember when we got to this place, the elder told us that, this woman is possessed and we're going to help her. And she was out in her yard, and I remember her being, this is how I told the story to the kids, or to my, classmates at the time. I remember her being really tight and constricted. I remember her crying. I told the group, I remember it just feeling really, really heavy and dark. Like the energy, I don't know if I used the word energy, but the energy there was just really heavy and dark. And so we went into her home and went inside with her, and we sat on the floor, and we just prayed for a very, 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 very long time. I don't know how long, it could have been 40 minutes, it could have been 140 minutes. It was a very long time. We prayed so much that we repeated ourselves multiple times throughout. We traded around, me and another girl, and then the elder from this church, and we went around and we just prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. And after a very, very long time, this is what I told my friends that night, we felt just a lightness lift in that little tiny space. Everything became light and less dark. It became brighter. It just felt totally different. It was like a weight had lifted. And the women started to cry. And then the tears turned to a smile and to laughter. And then she started singing. And by the time we got up to leave her little house, she was out in the garden in front singing and laughing and thanking us, saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And so when I read Mark chapter 1 as I was preparing for this sermon, that story was the first thing that went on my list of notes. It came to mind immediately. And honestly, my biggest emotion that happened when I put that down on the list was a feeling of fear about telling you the story that I just told you, but also a feeling of embarrassment. And even a feeling of embarrassment about how I felt back then, even that night when I told the story. Because even though I was a young, zealous Christian, I was a young, zealous, fundamentalist Christian, I was very devoted and very dedicated. I think even at that time, I wasn't totally sure if I really believed that an exorcism was what really happened in that experience. If it was really real, like there was a part of me that, wondered if, this elder was really wanting to give us, these kids a good experience, or if the woman was attention seeking. Like I don't really know, but there's a part of me that wasn't totally sure, and so I felt embarrassed about telling the story that I did. And I also feel some embarrassment right now, because I'm not sure if I really believe in demon possession or in exorcism or evil spirits in that way. In fact, this just now is the first time I've ever told the story in public since it happened. I don't know about you, but when my rational, Western, scientific, postmodern, white self reads and hears stories like the one in Mark chapter 1 about the impure spirit, and even as I think back about my own experience, I can't help but sort of question things, question that surface reading. A couple of weeks ago, I was watching Craig speak and kind of introduce this series on Mark just a couple of weeks ago, and he made the observation that in the history of Loma Linda University Medicine, there hasn't been a diagnosis of demon possession. It just hasn't happened. And you would think that you would at least have one case in all these years, but it just hasn't taken place. And even thinking about myself, like I'm an associate marriage and family therapist. Woo, woo, I made it. I'm not licensed yet, but it's one step close. I think the last time I preached, I just graduated. And so now I have a little piece of paper from the state, and it's really, really amazing. It's a wonderful thing. Well, in my training to become a therapist, one of the things that we do when we're thinking about like a diagnosis, this description, this sort of way of understanding what people are experiencing in their mental health suffering, we talk about differential diagnoses, like what are the different options that could be going on. We don't want to just have tunnel vision and think, well, this is what the person has. We want to consider, well, what could be the other things? And demon possession is not a differential diagnosis. It's not, and if I had this woman in my clinic today, I might encourage her to go see a physician. Maybe go see it. Like, could this be some kind of, epileptic thing going on? Like, I don't know. Like, get checked out. Like, what could there be going on? In terms of, like, my work, I might wonder, like, could this be a personality disorder? Could this be attention seeking? Could this be some sort of mood disorder? Like, is she having a panic attack? Like, there's lots of different options of things that I would think about, but demon possession would not be one of them. And so for me, when I run into stories like this, I'm left with the belief that a lot of times when people point to demon possession as an explanation, they're falling into what we call the causal fallacy, right? It's ascribing cause to something without really having evidence for that cause. And it's understandable because we as people, we have a huge need for understanding why. And so it makes sense why we might do that, but that's kind of where I land. And I have to say that acknowledging all of this out loud on stage feels uncomfortable for me. And it feels uncomfortable to hold both of these things at the same time, right? At the one hand, I hold this story of Jesus and this Jesus that I follow with my life. I hold this story and my own experience of what I saw and felt in Africa that time, and that experience that really impacted me greatly. And on the other hand, I also hold my, rational Western worldview that says there's probably better explanations, and I hold both of these things at the same time. In fact, in therapy, we would call that a dialectic, right? One of the types of therapy that I like to do with people is called DBT. We talk a lot about dialectics. And the important thing with DBT is to try to hold those in tension at the same time. It helps us feel better. Now, there's another wrinkle to all of this. And that's that I'm not really entirely comfortable with my Western critique of demon possession either. In a way, it kind of feels like it has an air of superiority to it, Like, it kind of feels like when I say, well, I don't really believe in that, I'm sort of putting on my colonialist, patriarchal, white, looking down my nose, oh, I know better than you, energy to it. And that doesn't feel good, and I don't think it does good either. As I was preparing for this sermon, I read a sermon by a woman named Ellie Dowd. She wrote a book called Baptized in Tear Gas, and it's a story about how she, as a white woman, became anti-racist. And she preached on this passage. She preached from the Lectionary some time ago, it was a couple years ago, and she preached on this passage, and I read her sermon, and one of her lines stuck out to me. She said, prioritizing, normalizing, and universalizing white Western ideas about spirituality is a form of white supremacy. That was arresting. And I think she's right. The truth is that there are thousands and thousands of cultural and religious traditions around the world that have a great respect for and an inclusion of a spiritual world that's not seen. There are many, many, many thousands of folk religions and different traditions around the world where the experience that I went through and the experience that we see described in Mark chapter 1 is entirely normal. I may have felt embarrassed when I went and had that activity with that elder. The elder, I don't think, was embarrassed at all. And so where does that leave us? It's sort of like I'm saying we can't and we must take this story seriously. It's a heavy thing, a heavy place to be at. So what value might it have at all? Well, I think there are lots of answers to that question. I'm going to give one suggestion. So I want to close this morning with an observation from the text, a personal disclosure, exploration, and then, as always, I will leave you with a poem. So back to the story in the Bible, Christian commentators almost universally identify and reflect on the theme of authority in this little snippet, but also in the first chapter of Mark as a whole. They highlight how authority is a really, really important theme that sticks out. And you can notice that in the beginning of the section on Mark chapter 1. At the very beginning in verse 21 and 22, the focus is not of this healing experience, right? This unclean spirit. The focus is on the way that Jesus teaches in the synagogue with an authority that folks had not seen before, right? That's what they're wowed by. And then at the end of the story, after everything happens with this man who was healed, again, folks are blown away, and it says that they go away murmuring, saying, we can't believe the authority that he teaches with. He has so much authority that even the demons obey him, right? The theme is all about authority. Well, authority over what? Well, one of my favorite texts, and you could, look it up or maybe get yourself a copy, but there's this text called the Annotated Jewish New Testament. It's really, really a wonderful text, and it's a great introduction for folks who are not from the Jewish tradition to be able to see how, when we read the New Testament as Christians, how themes from Jewish life and belief infuse everything. So I really, really love that one. But in that commentary, they talk about how for a lot of folks back then, the existence or the presence of disease was maybe not equivalent to demonic, but they were very closely related. That when someone was sick, when someone was going through something like that, it was the presence of overwhelming evil in their life. And so from a lot of folks' perspective, they suggest in this Jewish annotated New Testament that when folks would have read this story, they would have seen the eschatological undertones. That when Jesus does this healing, it's not just a healing for this one person, but he's signaling something that's happening bigger in the world and in his ministry. And the text actually talks about how this text in Mark chapter 1 echoes a prophetic reading about a coming deliverer from Isaiah chapter 35, where it reads, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped, and the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing, for waters shall burst forth in wilderness and streams in the desert." And so in this sense, through this lens, the story of Jesus driving out an impure spirit comes across as something like an announcement of God's presence. It's an announcement of the kingdom of God being here, of hope being present even in the face of overwhelming odds. We might read the story of Mark chapter 1 and the casting out of the impure spirit as God saying to us, God is not done yet. Wait and see. Everything isn't lost. The tide may feel overpowering, but the dawn is breaking just over the way. And I don't know about you, but that's a message that I could use today. On my podcast last week, I talked about how exhausting it feels to exist as a transgender person in 2024. And it's obvious that anti-trans rhetoric is being used as a political tool to get votes. A lot of people in 2024 have opinions about people like me that didn't know what people like me even existed 5 years before. It's very intentional, and yet it feels terrifying. It feels really, really scary that there are people that I know. There are people who are acquaintances and friends and neighbors want my existence in public to be considered obscene, who want my health care to be eliminated, who want histories and experiences of people like me to be erased, want us to pretend like they didn't happen. There have been a record number of laws proposed and passed, hundreds and hundreds just in the States, restricting trans people's rights in public. I mean, just this week in Ohio, a law passed that all but outlawed health care for trans people, children and adults, all of us. There's a law that passed in Utah just yesterday that essentially eliminates our legal status as human beings, saying no, that there are only male and female Those are the only two categories. And then if you try to live outside the roles that culture gives those categories, that you go to jail. We have local, just here in Redlands, here are candidates who are right now running for school board and city council on the platform that trans children do not exist and that trans adults are predators by being visible. I haven't met a trans person like me who hasn't at some point thought about whether or not we might have to go seek political asylum, or whether I might end up being a refugee somewhere. And that isn't hyperbole. Like, we have an appointment to get our passports updated, and we have it not because we have a trip planned. So it feels really, really heavy for me. The unclean spirit of transphobia is overwhelming. It's systemic. It's incomprehensible. It's all-encompassing. And that's just little old me. We all in this room face systems of oppression, you know? It says very little, my experience says very little of the haunting worldwide possessions by the demons of racism, climate change, nationalism, epidemics, fascism, greed, genocide, and other forms of extremism. And maybe for you, you share in some of my exhaustion and overwhelm and fear as I think about these overwhelming spirits. Maybe you need a little bit of hope. And for me, at least this morning, that's where Mark chapter 1 shines. Because I believe that the God who at once healed our ancestors of powerful, unclean, oppressive spirits is still at work today, even yet casting them out. And so maybe in the end, there are many valid ways of reading this passage from Mark chapter 1, this passage of demons and spirits and possessions. And maybe there are many ways because, as is the truth with all the stories in the Bible, they not only, maybe their power isn't quite as much that they happened, but that they happen. Those stories are our stories. Maybe what we need in the heaviness of the darkness is a little bit of hope and a little bit of a reminder that God is still at work. I'm going to close with a prayer, a poem. This is from Brueggemann. This is like hands down my favorite poem book of all time. It's just magnificent. Prayers for privileged people. And he has one in here that speaks directly to this, I think. It's entitled, Old Stories Become New Songs. So let's pray together. We love to tell the old story. We love to sing the old song of your saving deeds of mercy and freedom and healing and newness. We know about Exodus freedom and dancing tambourines. We know about land and huge clusters of grapes. We know about rivers of water and rivers of oil. And we know about the strangeness that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers cleansed, the dead are raised, and the poor rejoice. We know. We know. We know. give us courage to trust what we know and to obey what we hope. We know that the old story in our telling becomes a new, dangerous, transforming song. And so we sing. In just a moment, we're going to sing a song, I Want to Be the Love. And I want to ask all of you to sing it from your guts, to sing it from the depths of your soul as a defiant objection to spirits that are oppressing your life, our lives. The God who at once healed our ancestors of these spirits is at work even yet. Amen.